Hey everybody, hey everyone, this is Jackie Luke Mon. I have to clean off this other camera here. How are you? I hope you have been having a great day. My day has been a little bit chaotic. But I wanted to talk to you today about definitely a monumentous event, the passing of Fidel Castro, the former dictator and pretty much president for life of Cuba, this past weekend. I am broadcasting from Washington, D.C., by the way, for those of you who do not know where I live. And this is Jackie Luke Mon. And I want to talk to you today about a little bit of the history behind the U.S. involvement in the creation of the Cuba that created Fidel Castro, the revolution and the revolutionary. It is very important that we understand the history behind how Cuba was created, especially when we're listening to the narrative about Castro and Cuba in the media today. Sorry, the broadcast was interrupted. You guys, I'm having technology issues all the time. I don't know why. The connection is always weak when I try to talk to y'all. That's so annoying, but we're going to push through this. So hi everybody, it's Jackie Luke Mon, and we're talking about Cuba today. I'm letting you know, I want to let you know that this broadcast is going to be part one of a few broadcasts. Hi everybody, hi Marcy, hi Weston, hi Sunday, hi Melanie. I don't know how many broadcasts it's going to take to cover this whole subject of Fidel Castro and Cuba. And hi, Ashley, and what his legacy really means. But like I said, today we've got to start with the history of Cuba and how the U.S. and our policies and our involvement in Cuba pretty much shaped the revolution that overthrew a tyrant. And how we helped create this revolutionary in the form of Fidel Castro that our media is now excoriating as a tyrant and, a brutal dictator. I've got a distorted image. That's interesting. I don't know what that's about. So let's talk about what Cuba started as. Cuba was a colony of Spain, and it was a sugar plantation. It was basically a giant sugar plantation for Spain. So when you think of the word plantation, hi Miguel, so when you think of the word plantation, you know how they harvested sugar back in it was slavery. Yes, there was slavery in other places in the world outside of the United States. As a matter of fact, slavery was prevalent in many of the Caribbean nations, what are now Caribbean nations. Those Caribbean nations used to be colonies of larger empires. Cuba was a colony of Spain. And as I said, giant sugar plantation. So for a few centuries, Spain made all this money off of the sugar plantation that was Cuba until, of course, the Cuban slaves got tired of it. And they fought wars for independence against Spain. They actually fought 3 wars. And the third war they won, but they won with U.S. intervention. That's how they won the war. The United States got involved. Hi, Pat. Thank you. I'm glad you're happy to see me. I'm glad you're here. So the reason, let me explain to you, why the U.S. even got involved in the third war of independence that Cuba waged against Spain was because Spain broke off a trade deal with the United States. And the United States was angry with Spain and decided to help Cuba in its fight for independence from Spain because the United States wanted to punish Spain for breaking off the trade deal. It wasn't because the United States was all that interested in seeing Cuba gain its independence. the United States has, oh, what date? I'm sorry. Thank you, because I'm bad with remembering dates. Thank y'all. Thank you, Lana. The last War of Independence that Cuba fought and won. It's also called or known as the Spanish-American War from our history books. And that was fought between 1895 and 1898. Yes. So, the United States gets involved with a war between Cuba and Spain because the United States government is pissed off at a broken trade deal with Spain, wants to punish Spain. And in the process of helping Cuba break off the Spanish imperialist control, the United States then began to implement American imperial control in Cuba. Because for a while, the United States military occupied Cuba. That's what we've done in just about every country we have come to the aid of when we've helped them win a war of independence. We always stuck around and controlled stuff. You're welcome, Lana. So under American military administration of Cuba, Jim Crow type segregation was implemented on the island of Cuba. Now, remember, Cuba was a plantation colony. So you had a lot of the planter class that didn't want independence from Spain. And they were very afraid of the black population of Cuba overtaking them now that they had, yes, Lana, now Teddy Roosevelt, now that they had independence from Spain and they didn't have the backing from the Spanish government to perpetuate slavery, they were fine with any kind of way they could find to control this enormous black population that was now free in Cuba. So they allowed the United States military to implement Jim Crow-like segregation on the island of Cuba. That's right, Nilsa, all in the name of freedom. Yay, USA! So here you have, by the time 1940 comes around, and remember, the Cuban War of Independence from Spain ended in 1898. 1900 was when the United States began its military administration in full of Cuba and began to implement all of these regulations and laws that were adopted by this new Cuban government. And the new Cuban government was made up largely of members of the land-owning wealthy class of light-skinned white Cubans who were also Spanish. Some were Spanish immigrants and Cuban military members. Those were the people who made up the first free and independent government of a newly independent Cuba under the direction of the United States military. So it's against this backdrop that laws were created that forbade blacks from Haiti and Jamaica from immigrating to Cuba, but allowed Spaniards to immigrate to Cuba because the Cuban government and the American military wanted to tip the balance of the population in Cuba from a largely majority black population to a greater, lighter, whiter population. This process was based on a policy that was implemented in 1902, and it was actually called the whitening of Cuba. So, you now have a racial caste system in place that is supposed to be a part of a now free and independent society, where the people who used to run the plantations are now running the government. Them and their families. And these kinds of laws where black people, Afro-Cubans, mestizos, there are 42. Did you know that there are 42 different classifications of race / ethnicity / skin color in Cuba? 42. So it's against this backdrop of this kind of already segregated society that is very heavily favored toward the few who have land and wealth controlling everything, and the masses of people living in poverty who have nothing, and most of those people are black. Not all, but an enormously significant percentage of them are black. It's against this backdrop that the United States supports Fulgencio, I'm sure I butchered his name, Batista, to become president of Cuba. First in 1940, and he was president for 4 years from 1940 to 1944. Nilsa says, you heard that many who fled Cuba were the wealthy. Oh, I'm getting to that. We're not even at that point yet, but I'm getting there. That's why this is going to be in a couple of parts. So the United States supports Batista to be president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944. He was supposedly democratically elected to president in 1940. And he served 4 years. People hated him because the rich were rich and they stayed that way, and the poor were poor and they stayed that way, and there was repression, there was brutality, and they did not vote for him again. But in 1952, Batista staged a coup and took over the government again. And this time, with the United States support, they still supported him because Batista was a former Cuban military member. So he fought in the war for Cuban independence with the United States' help. And this time, between 1952 and 1959, what we know as Cuba today was basically cemented as the corrupt nation state that was basically owned by the United States, run by the American and Italian mafia. I'm not kidding. And that is what helped create Fidel Castro, the revolutionary, and Che Guevara. And that is what helped foment the revolution that Fidel Castro led. Why do I say that? Actually, I don't say it. John F. Kennedy explained the problems that led to Fidel Castro gaining power and leading a successful revolution. And I have to log back into my network again. And I'm having an issue doing that. But okay, I do have notes, so I'm not going to forget about the networks. Forgive me, guys. Sorry about that. So in 1960, then Senator John F. Kennedy made a speech at some Democratic dinner. And he's talking about the threat of communist Russia. Now, hey, Letitia, what's going on, girl? So you have to understand, in 1960, Americans were terrified of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was terrified of America. We had this Cold War going on where Americans were convinced that communism was going to take over the world and was going to shackle everybody, and the Soviet Union wanted to turn everybody into mindless communists. We're smarter now. We're smarter today. So we can look back at that period in history with 20/20 vision and say how silly we were. But it was a very real fear back then. So in 1960, then Senator John Kennedy is making this speech at a Democratic dinner, and he's talking about the threat of communist Russia in once friendly Cuba. That's the basis for this whole speech. But in this speech, he outlines the reasons Cuba was able to become ripe for a communist style government. And some of the things he said point directly to failure of the United States government to pay any attention to the social and economic plight of the Cuban people, especially in light of United States support of a corrupt and murderous dictator in the name of Batista. John F. Kennedy spoke about the fact that in 1959, U.S. companies owned 40% of Cuban sugar plantation lands. 40% of the land that sugar was grown on in Cuba. U.S. companies owned almost all of the cattle ranches in Cuba in 1959. U.S. interests owned almost all of the hotels, almost all of the casinos, and they were all run or had some type of influence by the American mafia. So I know this is going to sound really strange in a very serious discussion about history, but when you watch The Godfather Part 2 and you see the scene where Michael Corleone and the Corleone crime family and all of these other crime families are in Havana, and they're in this great hall at this New Year's Eve party, and there's this revolution going on in the streets, right? And you see this very ornate a leader who is telling all of these well-dressed people, all white, in this ornate hall in Havana, look, the rebels have taken over the city and we need to get out. That scene is actually telling the truth about the Cuban Revolution that Fidel Castro staged. That's what that scene was about. So when you see how the Italian and American mafia were involved in running and profiting from the casinos and the bordellos in Cuba, that's in The Godfather Part 2, that's actually true. When you see the American elite, American politicians, wealthy people from America and other parts of the country going to Cuba to have vacations and to participate in illicit activity, and that's true. Cuba was America's playground. It was the playground of the American wealthy. The problem was the Cuban people didn't profit off of any of it. American businesses did. American politicians did. American organized crime did. And so did Batista, who is rumored to have taken in up to 40% of the profit from the mafia-run casinos and bordellos. Actually, it's rumored that he took 30% and his wife took 10%. So Batista allowed this corruption to flourish in his administration. And he was able to allow this corruption to flourish because the United States supported him. The United States supported him so much that when the Cuban people rose up against him and staged a revolution, the United States government sent arms to Batista that he used to kill his own people. John F. Kennedy mentions that in his speech in 1960. He said it was one of the worst things that the United States government has ever done in regard to Cuba. Not only supporting this puppet terrorist dictator who allowed his country to be sold to greedy American interests, not only did we not care about the social and the economic conditions of Cubans, but we also gave gave artillery and weapons to the terroristic dictator to use against the people who we were stealing money from and that he was oppressing. John F. Kennedy said that in a public speech in 1960. John F. Kennedy also said that Batista was a tyrant and a murderer that the United States knew all about. They knew how much of a brutal monster that he was. Because it was John F. Kennedy who said that the United States provided armaments to Batista to crush the revolution against him, knowing full well that Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years. In the 7 years he was dictator from 1952 to 1959. What does that say to you? That says to you that the United States helped him do it. Kirsten says, we are doing this with Saudi Arabia now. Absolutely. So, and I'm sorry that I don't have the rest of this speech up. All of a sudden, my laptop decided to not respond to anything anymore. But I think, again, as I always say, that's just an indication of how important these conversations that we're having are. Because as people are now talking about how Fidel Castro was this brutal, evil dictator who murdered people. I'm not saying that he didn't. Understand what I'm not saying that Fidel Castro did not commit atrocities against people who opposed him. But when our media says of Castro that there's no reason for us to celebrate anything that he ever did because he was a brutal dictator, we are intentionally ignoring the fact that it was the United States that created not only the conditions for a brutal dictator like Batista to be allowed to not only take power in Cuba and oppress poor people, but it was the United States that allowed American interests, including organized crime, to profit off of Cuban labor and give those people nothing. So, in essence, it was the United States that created Fidel Castro. It was the United States that created Che Guevara. And I'm telling you that I'm not the one who's saying this. I am telling you what John F. Kennedy said. But like so much of what we learn and know today, we are only told a small segment of what's acceptable to corporate interests and political interests in this country about history, and especially history that involves us and how absolutely deplorable we have been in regard to foreign policy. Nilsa says, I need to do this more often. You're right, Nilsa, I do. My schedule is crazy. And I'm trying to make sure that I get some live streams in with you guys at least 3 times a week now. And I'm trying to keep them between 6 and 6:30 so that you know that I'm here at the same time, generally. And so is the whole Real Progressives team, by the way. We are ramping up to building a set schedule so you can tune in and listen to people talk about topics that are important to you, just like you would tune in the mainstream news, but you're getting actual facts and history from us. So yes, Nilsa, you're right. And we're working on that. So let's see, where was I? So Cuba was America's playground. The United States made a rack of money off of Cubans. Their labor didn't give them anything in return. The United States government knew that Batista was not only corrupt, the government was profiting off of the corruption. The American organized crime structure was profiting off of Cuban labor. Batista was profiting off it. The only people who weren't profiting off of labor in Cuba were the Cubans, were the poor, mostly dark-skinned Cubans. And this is where, as someone said before, that so many Cubans left. This is where that comes in. Because the Cuban people, as I said, tried to stage a revolution against Batista a few times. And those revolutions were brutally repressed by Batista with the help of the United States government. Well, that's until this bearded guy, Fidel Castro, comes down from the mountains, he and Che Guevara, and they stir up the people, and they pledge to not only kick the imperialist American interests out of Cuba and give Cuba back to the Cubans, they also pledged to ensure that the Cuban people benefited from everything that was Cuba, and they also pledged to end the racially segregated caste system in Cuba. Of course, all of the poor Cubans, all of the peasant class, all of the working class Cubans loved that. Because Batista had just murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years. Over 60% of the Cuban population was illiterate under Batista. Homelessness was rampant under Batista. Disease, sickness, people were poor. They didn't have access to health care, education, anything if they were not light-skinned and if they didn't have money. That continued because the United States government was in bed with Batista to profit off of the misery of the Cuban people. John F. Kennedy said as much. As a matter of fact, when I was reading the speech, and yes, when I boot up again and I get my stuff online, I'm going to give you the links to all of these, to the speech and to some other sources. As a matter of fact, here in the Washington, D.C. area, we have an airport that is named after the Secretary of State, who received a solid gold telephone from Batista as a gift, showing his appreciation for the assistance that the United States government gave the Cuban government during the Batista regime. That man's name is Dulles. Dulles International Airport. So listen, when we talk about, when the media talks about what a horrible person Fidel Castro was, and he was a tyrant, and he murdered people, and he imprisoned dissidents, he did. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that he didn't. He did imprison dissidents. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about that. But these same people who talk about how evil Fidel Castro was don't like to admit that we have an airport named after the Secretary of State at the time who sent military weaponry to Batista to help him kill 20,000 Cubans. We are hardly in a position to judge the leader of anybody else's country on anything. But at this point, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara descend from the mountains, not like in a cloud, but that's part of the revolutionary folklore. They train in the mountains for years, actually. And here is something that we revolutionaries need to begin to learn and understand. See, revolutions don't happen overnight. They're not successful overnight. Very often, they're not even successful the first, the second, the fourth time they're embarked upon. Because remember, the Cuban people revolted against Batista a few times. Fidel Castro went into the mountains of Cuba where peasants lived, where the farmers who didn't have any money lived, where the poor people lived. And you know what he did? You know what he and Che Guevara did up there in the mountains for 2-3 years? They educated people. They didn't arm people first. They didn't tell people, let's go down to President Batista's mansion and set fire to it first. No, they spent years educating people. So knowledge is not only power, ladies and gentlemen, it is the foundation of a revolution. And it is at this point in Cuban history where the Cuban people have been educated about why the system needs to change, because they hated it. They knew it. It didn't benefit them. They just didn't know how to change it. And now they have a leader who is going to help them do that. And Fidel Castro comes down, is successful with the revolution finally. And the reason there was a mass exodus of people from Cuba at that time when Castro took power was because he pledged, like I said, to take back Cuba from imperialist United States interests and give it back to the Cubans. That meant all of those people who owned land, who owned large businesses, who were wealthy, they were going to have to share. They were not going to be able to exploit the Cuban people and kick the profits back to Batista and the United States government. The United States government would no longer be allowed to operate, or the United States, U.S. companies would no longer be allowed to operate freely and with impunity in Cuba. So yeah, tens of thousands of wealthy, land-owning, mostly white or light-skinned Cubans left the night that Fidel Castro and his revolution took over Havana. So when we see people in Miami who are dancing in the streets because Fidel Castro died, a significant percentage of those people are either first generation from those immigrants, or they are those people who left Cuba themselves. That's a lot of history. That's a lot. And I even abridged some of it because you can't talk about everything. But I hope you understand now when people continue to have this conversation about Fidel Castro and who he is and how we should view him. We're not really talking about good or evil here. That's how the discussion is always framed. We in the West always look at what people in other countries do as either right or wrong, good or evil, based on our standards. When we do that, we open ourselves up to the criticism that, wait a minute, we contributed to the evil though. Because if we're saying that Fidel Castro was evil because of the things he did, and I'm going to talk about the things he did that were horrendous tomorrow. If we can talk about the things that Fidel Castro did that were horrendous and terrible and evil, we have to be honest and talk about the things that we did, that we contributed to, and that we allowed, that were just as bad. And that not only were they just as bad, but they led to the creation of Fidel Castro. So if we hate Castro, we've got to take a really hard look at what we did to create him. So I hope you guys... Oh, Shelley, that's a good point. How come China is okay, but not Cuba? That's a good point. And I might have to look into that. Thanks for asking that. Letitia is going to be on at 8. Oh, she's doing a 3-part. That's right. On Castro. Man, that's great. We are doing this in the Middle East. Rosalie, thank you for your comment. Weston, we have to be honest with what we created. Yeah, we do. Yes, we do. Ellen, during one of their first uprisings, Castro lost some men and he and others went on trial and were tortured. But for some reason, Castro was spared from torture. He said because his dark-skinned, oh, I have to click on his dark-skinned prison guard henchman was a good man. Yeah. I think this is going to be a few more series because there's so much to be unpacked about just the Castro regime of 47 years. Because as evil as we think Castro was, here's something I want you to keep in mind. And I want you to keep this in mind about every so-called despotic leader that the United States government has tried to kill. Because we've tried to kill them all. You cannot maintain control of any country's government. You cannot maintain control of a people for 4 decades through brutality alone. You cannot do it because the people will eventually rise up and fight back. So tomorrow, I'm going to talk some more about Fidel Castro, what his revolution brought to Cuba, why he is such a revered revolutionary figure among black people, not just in the United States, but around the world. And we are going to talk about some of the atrocities that he committed, because he did commit some. We need to be honest about that. I hope you guys learned some stuff today. Please share this video. Check us out on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're Real Progressives on YouTube. Check us out on our website where we have original content, Real Progressives USA. As always, stay tuned to Real Progressives for more live streams from more people on more stuff that you love to learn about. Share these videos and our content. Thank you all so much. I will respond to as many comments as I can when I'm done, and I will post the links to my sources for your enjoyment and edification. Y'all have a great night. See you tomorrow for part 2.